The much anticipated BRICS meeting, which was taking place in Russia in the city of Kazan, is over. And as expected, it did create a bit of a splash. Uh, in fact, around the world, eyes were on the meeting in Russia, not just because China, Russia, India, and Brazil and South Africa were going to be there, but there were new members. BRICS is emerging as a new club of sorts, which is not limited to any one particular geography, like SCO, which is basically an Asian continental kind of grouping. The BRICS is that way is far more global in its approach, and in a sense, the BRICS is also being seen as a kind of an alternate forum to the rich countries forum, which is the G7. Many people are expecting that despite it being a very disparate bloc, it presents a kind of an alternative to the Western dominated global economic system. To think that the de-dollarization is imminent, I think it could be the dream of some people, but I don't see it happen on ground. So I think we need to be careful about where we might be going in the context of the BRICS. Relations with China are really not going anywhere. Uh, and this is despite the fact that just on the eve of the BRICS summit, there was a kind of an understanding that was reached on the border standoff. It's a very, very tentative, small step which has been taken on the LAC. A decoupling would be good for India. Shifting manufacturing from China to India would be good for India. I agree with all of that, but let's not kid ourselves and imagine that we can cut ourselves away off from China completely. BRICS meeting, which was taking place in Russia in the city of Kazan, is over. And as expected, it did create a bit of a splash. Uh, in fact, around the world, eyes were on the meeting in Russia, not just because China, Russia, India, and Brazil and South Africa were going to be there, but there were new members which were also going to attend. And the Russians, in a sense, were using this forum to declare to the Western world that all the efforts to isolate them uh, have come a bit basically have come a cropper. They might be isolated in the West, but the West is a very tiny geography. It's not tiny in terms of its economic heft or its military prowess, but purely in terms of geographies, in terms of the number of people they represent, it's a very tiny place. And there are many more countries which are ready to engage with Russia. Not all those countries might agree with or endorse the Russian war in Ukraine. They might have their reservations, but that does not mean that they are going to disengage from Russia, isolate Russia, not have any kind of contact with Russia, or follow the Western lead on Russia. So the Russians did collect many people out there, many countries, and in a sense have made their point. So that was one point of focus on what the BRICS meeting was going to be all about. But I think it's also important to realize that BRICS is emerging as a new club of sorts, which is not limited to any one particular geography, like SCO, which is basically an Asian continental kind of grouping of countries. The BRICS is that way is far more global in its approach. In a sense, the BRICS is also being seen as a kind of an alternate forum to the rich countries forum, which is the G7. and it's many people tend to project it as a kind of a G7 bloc of the global South. But I think that's a bit of a stretch, because let's face it, the G7 are a group of countries which are, of course, very prosperous. Uh, but I think as a group, the G7 becomes extremely important because it controls the global economy in many ways. If you add up the GDP of the G7 countries, it's a huge amount. In the case of BRICS, you can add up the GDP of all the countries, but it still does not amount to the same thing. But more importantly, apart from the quantum of GDP or populations which the G7 and the BRICS countries represent, I think it is important that the G7 countries uh, coordinate their economic and their strategic policies very, very closely. They are all on the same page. And that can certainly not be said about the BRICS countries. Forget about the original members, even the new entrants to BRICS are not going to be entirely on the same page, either on matters of economic policies or, for that matter, on strategic issues. And then, of course, uh, within the BRICS bloc, there are countries which have serious problems with each other, and of course, the problems between India and China are one example of the kind of problems that are going to be in any kind of a BRICS grouping, trying to replicate a G7 model for the global South. One interesting part, of course, is, and I think this is important for many Indians who love to do a lot of chest thumping, is that the Chinese, despite the fact that they are in many ways the number two power in the world right now, both in terms of military prowess, in terms of technology, in terms of their economic footprint, uh, and yet you have the Chinese uh, say that they are a developing country, that they are members of the global South. They are still not ready to declare themselves as a kind of a superpower. Uh, and just juxtapose that against the kind of boasts that come out from many people in India who keep pretending as though we are a kind of an emerging superpower, which is quite some distance away, if at all. So I think we need to be careful on how we look at these forums, how we look at the realities of global politics, and the power differentials which actually exist on the ground, not in our heads but on the ground. And I think this is one takeaway for me, especially in the statement which the Chinese president made, the opening statement during his bilateral with Mr. Modi. But I'll come to that in a bit. I think it is. It is. I think what is critical as far as BRICS is concerned is that many people are expecting that, despite it being a very disparate bloc, it presents a kind of an alternative to the Western-dominated global economic system. I My own sense is that it might well emerge to be one, but at least not for the foreseeable future. I don't see it uh, either replace or give a very stiff competition to the Western dominated economic system. There are some achievements which the BRICS have, and I think the most notable is, of course, the New Development Bank. Prime Minister Modi also spoke about it in his opening remarks at the BRICS Forum. Uh, but apart from that, there isn't a whole lot of other stuff that the BRICS has been able to do in terms of coordinating, actions between these countries, coming on the same page. That's still not happening. So at one level, you can call it a kind of a new club, which is still to set the rules of the club. But I think what a lot of people are looking at is, and there is a lot of talk about it, they are looking at a kind of an alternative emerging to the dollar, which is the global currency, really. And there is a lot of talk of de-dollarization. There is an image of a BRICS currency note floating around. Uh, but again, people really haven't thought this through. Uh, Despite the fact that the G7 countries, or Western Europe and the United States and its allies, uh, have very closely coordinate their policies. They trade with each other. Most of their trade is with each other. Despite all of that, they are still not a single currency. The dollar might be the most accepted currency, but it's still not the single. They still don't have a single currency. So to think that there will be a kind of a single acceptable currency uh, within the BRICS bloc, I think that's quite some distance away. It's not going to be something which will happen in the next few months, maybe even in the next few years, unless, of course, the Americans, who are quite apt to do it, self-destruct. They are ready to commit economic suicide with their profligacy, and they destroy the domination of the dollar. If that is happening, if that happens, then all bets are off. But if that is not happening, then to think that the de-dollarization is imminent, I think it could be the dream of some people, but I don't see it happen on ground. So I think we need to be careful about where we might be going, uh, in the context of the BRICS grouping. But the BRICS grouping and the talk of a single currency or de-dollarization, I think from the Indian point of view, also becomes critical, because we have to understand what exactly are we talking about. If you displace the dollar, it could well be jumping from the frying pan into the fire, because what is the dollar going to be replaced by? If the dollar's dominance is going to be replaced by the dominance of the yuan, the Chinese currency, then is that something that India will be comfortable with? I don't see how India could accept or desire a system in which the dollar is displaced by the yuan. So I think we need to be very careful about what we are talking about, what we are trying to get into, um, and whether we are in a position that if the dollar was to be dethroned and the yuan was to become, in a manner of speaking, the reserve currency of the world, would how would that serve India's interests? So I think we need to be very careful on that, especially because our relations with China are really not going anywhere. Uh, and this is despite the fact that just on the eve of the BRIC summit, there was a kind of an understanding that was reached on the border standoff. It's a very, very tentative, small step which has been taken on the LAC. Some patrolling is going to be allowed. Some standard operating procedures are being worked out. Uh, and there is a hope that this is a kind of the first step towards bringing things back on an even keel, insofar as the LAC is concerned. Now that's the hope, which has been expressed by the External Affairs Minister, which has been expressed by the Army Chief, and other senior officials. And there is this hope that once trust and confidence starts building up between the two sides, then the 3D formula, which is disengagement, de-escalation, and de-induction of troops who are engaged in a eyeball to eyeball kind of a situation along the borders, uh, and which has created a kind of instability along the LAC, will actually fructify. But while any step which leads to a reduction in tension between India and China along the LAC is to be welcomed. While I don't entirely disagree with people who say that, look, you cannot completely isolate China, that despite the fact that we might desire decoupling our economic dependence on China in terms of the number of goods that we import from China, a decoupling would be good for India. shifting manufacturing from China to India would be good for India. I agree with all of that, but let's not kid ourselves and imagine that we can cut ourselves away off from China completely. Uh, we have to accept that in the global economic system which currently obtains, China remains a very critical player. And we are not really doing China a favor by buying stuff from them. If we are buying stuff from them, uh, whether it is, and I don't mean buying the icons which we use for Diwali, the deities that we import from China for Diwali, or the Diwali lights. I don't mean, or the toys that we import from China. I don't mean that kind of stuff. I mean more substantive kind of stuff that we import from China is something that our industry requires. It's something that we use to then make more products which we sell to the rest of the world. So we need to understand that adopting a very mercantilist approach on trade with China is not necessarily in India's favor. That does not mean that we do not aspire to decouple our economy from China, to find sources other than China in a range of products that we need for our own development, and of course ensuring that we keep China out of critical infrastructure. Uh, Once again, how serious we are about critical infrastructure is again a matter of debate. In a country where the Navy and the Air Force take pride in the fact that they have signed a contract with a foreign company, an American company, um, a taxi company, to ensure that there are personalized profiles of all Indian Air Force and Indian Navy officers and their families. The kind of mindlessness with which we operate uh, then makes you ask whether any purpose is really going to be served by shutting off China from entering into India's critical infrastructure. If you are opening yourself to the United States in this way, even if it's to a company, of course, if we imagine that US companies are completely independent of their governments, then if we want to kid ourselves, we can. But the fact of the matter remains that in the real world, that's not the way things happen. So, uh, uh, but to come back to China, I think it is important, as far as I am concerned, to keep China out of critical infrastructure. But we should be careful not to cut our nose to spite China's face. That seems to be the direction in which the government is moving. But it needs to do a lot more to attract trade and industry back to India, especially the ones who are leaving China, or who have become more skeptical about China in recent years. That is as far as China is concerned, or the economic relations with China are concerned. But look, there is the strategic dimension which we tried to sort out in this particular meeting between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi. So, like I said, if the tensions have come out, that's good. But if we really think that the re-engagement at the diplomatic level with the special envoys going to restart discussions on settling the border question. Uh, they've had discussions, plenty of rounds of discussions in the past, and a fat lot of good it's done. There has really been no understanding. Even the understandings that had been reached with China in the 90s and even later have been undone by the events which happened in 2020. The Chinese belligerence has ensured that no amount of understanding which you have with them is worth anything, because the day the Chinese realize that they are in a position, or they are in a mood to push you, poke you, they will do it. Which actually raises the question of whether um, we can actually start de-inducting troops which have been deployed along the LAC. Again, I give the Kargil example. We used to withdraw from the Kargil heights. The Pakistanis would do the same, and then one fine day, the Pakistanis decided that they will race us to those heights and occupy the heights, and then threaten India's security, which is what led to the Kargil war. This is exactly what the Chinese have done in 2020. So are we now in a mood to once again start trusting China that maybe 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now they will not do something similar what they did in 2020? How many times are we going to fool ourselves? So and if we are not in a mood to fool ourselves anymore, if we become a lot more realistic, then can there be deinduction or redeployment of the troops that are along the borders, especially given the fact that India does not have the same terrain advantage which China has to mobilize troops very fast, nor does India have the infrastructure that the Chinese have built to mobilize troops. And we should not forget that in the last 4 years, the Chinese have developed a lot more infrastructure, including border settlements, which allow them, even if they were to vacate those places, which allows them to reoccupy those places relatively quickly, which would take us a long time. So I think there are going to be serious questions on these issues going forward. Uh, and this brings me to the final point which I wanted to cover in today's podcast, which is the Pakistan factor in the context of BRICS. Now, Pakistan wants entry into the BRICS. There have been some reports that India has agreed to endorse Pakistan's entry into BRICS. I am myself quite skeptical whether the Indian government is going to be so foolish as to allow Pakistan to enter. Uh, the BRICS forum, because India does exercise a kind of a veto on who the new entrants are going to be. And the Prime Minister himself has said that it has to be by a consensus, and wishes of the original members need to be respected in this regard. Uh, but still, those rumors or those reports are persisting that India might have agreed or might agree to allow Pakistan into the BRICS. Frankly speaking, what's the quid pro quo? What are we getting from the Pakistanis in return? And India's track record has been abysmal in this regard. We have always thought that if you're nice to the enemy, then it will yield dividends going forward, little realizing that in international relations, especially with enemy countries like Pakistan, no good deed that you do will go unpunished. The Pakistanis have proved it time and time again. uh, we've allowed them entry back into the Commonwealth at one point of time, into the NAM. We facilitated it, a number of other forums, and finally, it served no purpose as far as we are concerned. So, if we are now going to give a nod to Pakistan's entry into BRICS, what is the quid pro quo? Now, is the quid pro quo that okay, the Pakistanis have agreed that they will restore relations at the level of the high commissioners, which is something they will have to do if they want any kind of a relationship with us, anyways. Now, for the crumbs of allowing a high commissioner level relationship to be restored, we are giving the Pakistanis entry into a forum uh, which which is going to be permanent. Uh, I would imagine that this is the epitome of strategic myopia, if at all this was to happen. Of course, if the Pakistanis were to give us something really substantial, which is what we want from them, whether it's on Kashmir, whether it's on a range of other issues, then certainly India can look at endorsing their entry into BRICS as a quid pro quo. But short of that, for the crumbs of a high commissioner level relationship or the piddly little trade that we'll have with the Pakistanis to facilitate their entry into the BRICS, would be strategic purblindness of the worst kind. So I hope and I trust that the Indians have learned their lessons from the past follies that they have made in this regard. But with India, you can never be sure. Because there is so much virtue signaling, especially which happens among Indian diplomats who want to pretend that we are always going to be nice, we are always going to be very expansive, We are not going to be mean minded. This is not being mean minded. This is strategic, being strategically myopic. So I hope, at least at the political level, there is enough savvy to ensure that there is going to be no endorsement of Pakistan, unless, of course, there is a solid quid pro quo uh, on a very substantive issues. Uh, and without that, to endorse Pakistan would be a blunder of great magnitude.